Morning. Good to see all of you here. I'm going to stick to my notes or I'd be up here for half an hour because I'm going to introduce Dr. Keith Swenson, who's no stranger to this organization. And I am really looking forward to what he has to share about the Galapagos. So, Dr. Swenson is a retired medical doctor who now teaches courses in biology and geology at Multnomah University in Portland. He also served for 20 years as president of Portland's Design Science Association, was on the board of the Seven Wonders Museum near Mount St. Helens. Keith especially enjoys leading field trips, which he does an excellent job, I'd say, having been on many of them, and has taken thousands to Mount St. Helens, the Columbia Gorge, Northwest Forests, and the Grand Canyon. How many have been on his field trips just by? Yeah, most of you. That's wonderful. He co-leads with Dr. Stephen Austin periodic trips into the Little Grand Canyon at Mount St. Helens. Keith has a Bachelor of Science in Zoology from the University of Idaho and an MD from Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. He and his wife Connie have 4 grown children. Keith, we're really looking forward to what you have to share about the Galapagos. So, thank you. Come on up.
Well, thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. Has anybody been to the Galapagos? I don't think so. If you ever get a chance, go. It's a fantastic place, and I'll try to show you that this morning. We have our system working well, I think, here now, so after a few struggles. Okay, the title of today's program is Voyage to the Galapagos. And yes, the colors of this slide are significant. The islands of the Galapagos were all born of volcanic fire, red-hot molten lava, which solidified to black rock. And Galapagos is inextricably linked to this man, Charles Darwin, who visited the islands in 1835. Even as a kid, I knew that Galapagos were Darwin's islands, and studying biology in college only solidified that belief. Here's my freshman college biology text, which I used in 1962, that kind of dates me, I guess, at North Park College in Chicago. And it reads, "The flora and fauna of oceanic islands also provide evidence of evolution. As a young man, Charles Darwin became interested in the animals on the Galapagos Islands, 500 miles off the west coast of South America. He found that 23 of the 26 species of land birds on the islands were peculiar to the archipelago, yet they were all obviously related to the birds of South America. He found 11 kinds of giant tortoise, each kind inhabiting a different island. They were all related, but those farthest apart were the most unlike." Well, in July and August of 2008, Connie and I went on a voyage to Ecuador and the Galapagos. And we flew from Texas to Quito, but it wasn't without difficulty. Somewhere over the Caribbean Sea, we lost oil pressure in one of our engines and had to make a nighttime emergency landing in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. But we got going again, and the next morning we arrived in Quito, which you see here. Now, an interesting place near Quito is this geographical marker. And I'm standing directly over the Earth's equator, with one foot in the northern hemisphere and one in the southern hemisphere. And the Galapagos Islands are similar in that they also straddle the equator, some being in the northern hemisphere, but most being in the southern. Well, from Quito, we flew via Aerogal, 600 miles directly west over the Pacific Ocean, and notice the marine iguana riding on our tail there. And here we have arrived. The airport is at the the top of this map, an island called Baltra, was once actually a military base for the United States in World War II. But we took a short ferry ride across a narrow piece of water there to Santa Cruz, a much larger island. And then we took a bus across Santa Cruz to the bottom where my yellow arrow is, the Puerto Ayora. And at that point, we boarded the Anahe, which was to be our home for the rest of the journey. Anahe was the name of the captain's daughter, and part of the way she accompanied us as well. But the Anahe generally traveled between islands during the night. So each morning we would wake up offshore, anchored by a different island. And then we used these zodiacs, or locally they're called pangas, to reach the nearby shores. Here's Connie. And the group usually spent part of each day snorkeling, which was spectacular and varied. We snorkeled in shallow water and in deep, in calm water and in fast currents. On one occasion, our panga led us out on the north side of a small island, and the current took us to the island's far end. We were then picked up and led out in a different current, which took us along the south side of the same island. We also swam with beautiful fish, penguins, sea turtles, and sea lions. On one occasion, we saw sharks resting on the bottom below us. Our guide told us that sharks don't bother people in the Galapagos, so we weren't concerned. And we did fine. Here we've landed to explore an island, and we walked on many beautiful white coral sand beaches. And we hiked across expansive lava flows, some of which appeared to be of fairly recent origin. This one is about 100 years old, I believe. We also hiked to the interior of islands, often through dry brush like this. And through all of our travels, we were reminded that these still are the islands of Charles Darwin, as seen in this sign, and in this evolution gift shop, and in numerous displays, interpretive displays. Well, I would like to now present to you an overview of the physical setting and the biology of the Galapagos Islands, and do so based on a straightforward understanding of the Bible. And then later, I will return to Charles Darwin and his interpretations. So first, let's consider the geography of Galapagos. The archipelago lies 600 miles off the coast of South America in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. And this is a remote location, and that will be very important when we consider how plants and animals were able to colonize these islands. Recall also that the equator passes right through the islands, and the archipelago consists of 13 so-called large islands and 6 small islands. And then there's over 40 tiny islets, and there's also a whole variety of unnamed reefs and exposed rocks. The total area of the Galapagos is somewhat over 2 million acres. That's the land area there. And so that's about almost like Yellowstone National Park would be. And the length of the island chain is about 267 miles. The large islands are usually known by their Spanish names, which are listed here. Originally, these islands had English names, and then they were changed officially to Spanish names when Ecuador annexed the Galapagos in 1832. But the islands are Isabela, by far the largest one, Santa Cruz, where we boarded the Anahe, Fernandina, Santiago, San Cristobal, Floriana, Marchana, Espanola, Pinta, Baltra, where our plane landed, Santa Fe, Pinzon, and Genovesa. And the map here shows most of the islands. There's 2 tiny ones, Darwin Island and Wolf Island. Yeah, Darwin Island and Wolf Island are to the northwest, and they're about 100 miles away, so they're off the map. But the rest of them are on this map. And note Isabela, which is to the left. It's the largest island by far. You can see the volcanoes that make up the island. And it's shaped like a seahorse, and the equator goes right through the seahorse's head. In the center is the island of Santa Cruz and Baltra, where we began the trip. So let's then look at the geological history of Galapagos. And there's an important clue right off the bat, apparent to any visitor, and that is that the islands are made exclusively of volcanic rock and represent the topmost parts of huge underwater volcanoes or volcanic mountains. This small island is named Daphne Major. Probably you've heard of it. It's a rather well-known island. And it is the top of a volcanic cone. I think you can appreciate that. You see the crater, and then this would extend thousands of feet down to the bottom of the ocean. The bulk of this volcano is underwater. Daphne Major is really well known because it is the site where Peter and Rosemary Grant conducted their famous studies of Darwin's finches. And I will refer to that later on. But I want you to notice the faint trail that extends from the ocean up to the crater, somewhat to the left of center. You got to look hard to see it. But that is the Grant's Trail, because this island has no beaches. It has only cliffs, except in one place there's a ledge that when the waves kind of bring the panga up, they can jump off and get onto the island and offload their supplies in the same fashion. It's rather precarious. Then they hike that trail to a camp, which I'll show you later on, that's right at the edge of that crater. So that's Daphne Major. Here we see a small volcanic cone. I think it's a spatter cone, and it's a landscape of very old, well-weathered volcanic rock. And this one is similar, but with a small, much younger lava flow superimposed on top of the old volcanic rock. Many of the flows have this complex, ropey sort of appearance that you can see here. And this is basalt, a type of lava rock. That's basalt that makes up many of the cliffs in the Columbia Gorge here. And this ropey pattern is called pahoehoe lava. That's a Hawaiian term. I think it means ropey. And it contrasts with another form of lava flow in these islands, and that's a'a lava. And that's kind of has rock that's just broken up, and it's got sharp edges and so forth. And I was told that a'a means what you say when you walk barefoot across those lava flows. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Another clue to the geological history of the Galapagos Islands is this. The islands to the southeast are older than those to the northwest. So Hispaniola and Floriana at the bottom right were formed well before Fernandina and Isabella on the middle left. Accordingly, the old islands show no signs of recent volcanic activity. Their rock is well weathered and eroded, and they are covered with vegetation. In contrast, the islands like Isabella and Fernandina, the new islands, have limited plant growth, and they're less eroded, less weathered, and have recently erupted. For example, the volcano on Fernandina, which is the island to the farthest to the left, that erupted in January of 2020. So what is the reason for these observations? And the answer is that Galapagos is moving on the Nazca tectonic plate directly over a volcanic hotspot. And this is the same mechanism that produced the Hawaiian Islands. Now, here you see that explanation depicted, and the orange circle represents the hotspot, which would be a giant plume of hot material, some molten material, that rises from deep in the earth, and this plume stays fixed in the same location on the surface, or on the earth. It doesn't move. In contrast, the Nazca plate, represented by the arrow there, does move directly over the hotspot towards the southeast. Eventually, this plate, which includes the ocean bottom and the islands, eventually this plate moves underneath or subducts under the South American plate. So in the past, the old islands, like Espanola, Floriana, formed over the hotspot, but they have since moved beyond it. And Fernandina and Isabella are currently over the hotspot and are volcanically active. So that's the basic geology of this place. Now, creationist geologists generally place big tectonic events like this in the context of Noah's flood. Now, you probably have heard of catastrophic plate tectonics, which postulates that plates moved rapidly during the flood and have since slowed to their present rates, which is about as fast as your fingernail grows. Now, plate tectonics is not a proven thing. It's got some problems, but certainly is something that we have discussed significantly. And then most creationists would place the formation of the Galapagos Islands in the late flood and early post-flood periods, but with some greatly reduced activity extending to the present day. Well, let's move on. When we came to Galapagos, I had visions of snorkeling in warm tropical waters. After all, we were right on the equator. So when offered one of these wetsuits, I declined. And to my surprise, I nearly froze. The water was cold. How could that be? Likewise, I expected the islands to be covered by lush tropical rainforests, similar to what we had seen when we'd been in Hawaii. But I was wrong again. The Galapagos, especially at low elevation, not so much on the higher hills, but at low elevation, were generally dry, and cactuses flourished. So why was that? To find the answers, let's turn to the science of oceanography. And in doing so, we learned that the sea and the land of the Galapagos are greatly influenced by three major ocean currents: the Humboldt Current, the Cromwell Current, and the Panama Flow. And these complex currents greatly influence the climate and the biology of the islands. Here we see the currents depicted in a very simplistic fashion. It's a little more complex than that. Most things are more complex than what I'm telling you when you look deeply into them. But moving north along the coast of South America is the cold and nutrient-rich Humboldt Current. And from the west along the equator flows a deep and cold, also nutrient-rich Cromwell Current. And from the north comes the warm and nutrient-poor Panama Flow. And the convergence and complex interactions of these three currents regulate to a great extent the temperature and the nutrient content of the oceans surrounding the Galapagos, as well as the climate of the Galapagos itself. Let me just, as an aside, mention this man. He is Matthew Fontaine Maury. And Maury was a United States naval officer in the 1800s and a firm believer in the Bible. And because of a scripture passage which mentions the paths of the sea, that's found in Psalm 8, he went looking for currents in the oceans, and he found them. And today he is honored as the father of oceanography. Except that in the summer of 2020 he was canceled and his statue in Richmond, Virginia, removed. Maury opposed slavery, but he served in the Confederate Navy. He could not bring himself to fight against his home state of Virginia. Well, I mentioned Maury partly to quote from him, in that he gave a great description of an ocean current. Now, this is not the Galapagos. He was never in the Galapagos, but this is the Gulf Stream, a current that crosses the Atlantic Ocean. So he wrote, "There is a river in the ocean. In the severest droughts, it never fails, and in the mightiest floods, it never overflows. Its banks and its bottom are of cold water, while its current is warm. The Gulf of Mexico is its fountain, and its mouth is in the Arctic seas." And then he goes on to describe the ecology of the seas. And he says this: "The inhabitants of the ocean are as much the creatures of climate as are those of the dry land. For the same almighty hand which decked the lily and cared for the sparrow fashioned also the pearl and feeds the great whales, and adapted each to the physical conditions by which his providence has surrounded it." I believe Matthew Maury would have enjoyed a trip to the Galapagos Islands. Let's briefly mention the Galapagos climate. First of all, the Galapagos experiences two seasons. There is the warm and wet season, which is about January to June, in which the skies are generally clear, but there are frequent rainstorms. So the islands are green with vegetation. And then there's the cool and dry season, which is about July to December, during which there is often a thin cloud layer, but little rain, or often no rain for months. Plant life at low elevation dries up and the landscape turns brown. However, there is a light misty rain in the high elevations, which keeps those areas somewhat lush and green. And we, as well as Darwin, visited Galapagos during the dry season. He was there in September, we were there in July and August. So the conditions would have been somewhat similar. Now, the climate of the Galapagos is exceedingly complex, and I'm not going to try to explain it in depth, but let me just mention 4 factors that are important. The ocean currents, which I mentioned, are major determinants of the Galapagos climate. For example, from July to December, the cold water of the Humboldt Current impacts the islands. The oceans are cold, as I discovered snorkeling, and the air temperature is also cooler. And then from January to June, the warm Panama flow dominates, and both the sea and the land are warmer. Trade winds are important. They act to push the surface ocean currents. In the cool season, the southeast trade winds propel the Humboldt Current to the islands. In the contrast, in the wet season, the northeast trade winds tend to drive the warm Panama flow current south to Galapagos. And then the elevation makes a difference. Certainly during the dry season, the trade winds force air upward, and where it cools and moisture condenses, and it produces a light misty rain at high elevations, but not at low elevations like where we visited. And lastly, every several years, this poorly understood phenomenon called El Nino causes drastic, and I mean drastic, oceanic and climatic changes in Galapagos. The nutrient-poor warm water from the western Pacific spreads through the islands, rainfall increases, and plants flourish. But since the ocean lacks nutrients, there's a die-off of marine creatures. And then all of the land animals that depend on the ocean for food also die. In 1982, 1983, in an El Nino event, and again in 1997 and 98, populations of seabirds, sea lions, marine iguanas, and many other species were just decimated, but subsequently recovered. So this complex Galapagos climate would have developed following Noah's flood, as oceanic and atmospheric patterns became established. Initially, of course, that would have been during the time of the post-Noahic flood ice age. That's enough on the physical aspects of the Galapagos ecosystem. Let's look at some of the biology. And we'll consider marine life, plants, invertebrates, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The ocean surrounding the Galapagos teems with organisms of all sorts, and we got a good glimpse of that while snorkeling. These fish are called yellow-tailed grunts, and there are over 300 species of fish in Galapagos waters. And a major reason for the abundance of marine life is the cold and nutrient-rich Humboldt and Cromwell currents. They are just loaded with nutrients, and they support a huge biomass ranging from microscopic plankton up to sperm whales. However, when you come to the El Nino years, as I just mentioned, warm, nutrient-poor water dominates the islands and the marine populations crash. Well, we saw Pacific green sea turtles while snorkeling. These animals live in the ocean and only come ashore to lay their eggs. On the coral sand of Santa Cruz, we found nest depressions and fragments of sea turtle eggs. Sometimes huge numbers of hammerhead sharks patrol Galapagos waters. I'm told that's about the only place on Earth where you get these big schools of hammerheads. It's quite impressive. Believe it or not, I took this photo myself. The image was part of an interpretive display, and I photographed the image. But actually, sharks don't hurt people in the Galapagos, so I don't think there's any problem with these. I don't believe they have been a threat to man. A question now arises as to how plants and animals got to the Galapagos. And remember, these islands are 600 miles from the nearest land. And so concerning the ocean life, the answer is easy. Many marine organisms survived Noah's flood, and the floodwaters, and modern sea creatures, of course, are their descendants. But what about the plants and land animals? How did they cross 600 miles, at least 600 miles of ocean to the Galapagos? And this slide lists a few of the options. Certainly, vegetation or log mats would be a possibility. Like at Mount St. Helens on Spirit Lake, we have a log mat that's been floating there since the eruption. And after Noah's flood, of course, all the ocean, all the pre-flood forests and vegetation would be ripped up and floating on the waters. And then also, after that, there would be flooding on South America, and the South American rivers would carry masses of vegetation into the ocean, so you could have floating mats very easily. Pumice can sometimes be erupted by underwater volcanoes and produce floating mats of rock, because pumice is very light and it floats. Ocean currents, of course, carry floating material, and these currents come directly at Galapagos, so it makes sense. They would be carrying things to the islands. Then you also have aerial transport of birds and bats and insects, and certain light seeds and spores can travel that distance in the air. And we can't discount human transport either. This could be accidental, like the rats of a ship coming ashore, or intentional, and people have speculated whether maybe the giant tortoises were brought by humans in the first place. That's not known, but it's been certainly considered as a possibility. Now, it's extremely important you understand this slide. This is key, and so I want to explain it fairly carefully. No, this is not Galapagos. This is an orchard near Hood River, near Mosier, I guess I took, but it'll give you the idea. So, it concerns the created kinds, also called baramins. And Genesis 1, chapter 1, talks about God creating according to their kinds. So we have created kinds. And Frank Marsh, I believe it was, coined the term baramin. It's from the Hebrew. This is not Hebrew, but it's two Hebrew words put together. Bara, meaning create, and min, or mean, meaning kind. So a created kind and a baramin those are synonyms. Many people think that creationists do not believe in any sort of change in plant and animal populations, such as the formation of adaptations or of new species. That's a common belief even today. But it's not true. Creationists do hold to very significant changes in organisms and do hold to the formation of adaptations and of new species. Genesis tells us that God created various kinds of life. It doesn't say species. And these created kinds were to reproduce after their kind. Creationist biologists generally believe that each created kind was programmed somehow with a wide range of capabilities, many of which maybe were hidden and not seen at the time of the creation, but that these animals and plants could diversify within the created kinds. And this is called mediated design. I think this was Todd Wood that brought this term to light in the early 2000s, I believe. But mediated design is that idea that the created kinds had great capability of diversification within the kind. Not that they're going to turn into something beyond their kind, but within the kind. And someone has likened it to a Swiss Army knife. You have a Swiss Army knife and you take out the blade and whittle on a piece of wood, but then you find, you need to open a bottle with a cork. So you take out the corkscrew and take out the bottle cap, and then you put that in, and then you find you need to loosen the screw, so you take out the screwdriver. In other words, it has certain things that are visible at a given time, but it also has many hidden capabilities. So as plants and animals spread over the earth after creation and also after Noah's flood, they spread out and they diversified. They had to form new adaptations appropriate for the changing environments they were going into. And, of course, many new species formed. If God had made plants and animals unchangeable and they moved out into different environments, they wouldn't be fit for those environments, and they would probably die. And so God, in his wisdom, had to give animals and plants the capability of adjusting to different climates, different conditions. But the important point here also is that these changes remain strictly within the genetic boundaries of the created kinds. No kind developed into something else. No dinosaurs turned into birds, for example. The modern biblical creation view of the origin and history of life can be thought of as being like an orchard, not a single tree, but an orchard of trees. And Darwin's view would be, of course, that all life is on the same tree. There was a spark of life, life developed, and all life is related to all other life as being on one family tree. But the creation view is that life didn't start that way. It started out as separate kinds, and diversification occurred within those kinds. And in this diagram, you can see the orchard, and look at the right, the dog kind. So dogs would be created as a kind in Creation Week, represented at the base of that tree. And then as time goes on, as you move higher in the tree, you can see that the species formed. There's different species of wolves, there's coyotes, different species of foxes, and so forth. And even people had been able to take dogs and breed them and get poodles and 300 or more other breeds of dogs. But not just dogs, you've got bears doing the same thing, bats. There's 1,000 species of bats across the earth now. Cats, and then you could put every other family of mammals on a separate tree. And then you could add the birds, the reptiles, the amphibians, the fishes, and then the plants. This is the way life seems to be. Now, you can take a demonstration from just a field guide. This is Mammals of Washington and Oregon by Tamara Eder. I open up this book, and I find bears. Well, there's more than one species. Okay, I turn it here to bats. Oh, there's lots of bats in the Northwest, lots of species. I turn it here to squirrels, lots of species of squirrels. Here's cats. There's several species of cats. So this book is clumpy. It's arranged in groups, which we call families of mammals. And that's the idea, that you can look out in nature and you see the pattern that's described in this book. There's not a continuum of everything merging into everything else. They are distinct groups. Within each group, there is diversification. So that's the point. Now, I think many of you probably were here and heard Phil Gaskell in October. I didn't hear him, but I saw part of the recording. And I know he talked about a new model for adaptation called something like continuous environmental tracking and engineering optimization. And I'm using a term mediated design as maybe a term that would include that sort of concept, but I'm not going to be using Phil Gaskell's terminology. It's too long for me to pronounce, but also it's not well developed yet. I understand the Institute for Creation Research is embarking on a big project to really try to flesh out what this means and how adaptations occurred according to these sort of ideas. So stay tuned on that and look at Phil's YouTube recording if you haven't already heard his talk. Well, moving on now, all the land surfaces in the Galapagos were at one time were newly formed volcanic rock, totally devoid of life. Then plants and animals and other organisms gradually had to colonize these landscapes. For old islands like Espanola and Floriana, that occurred thousands of years ago. But for others like Fernandina and Isabela, the initial colonization by life is happening today. And ecologists call this process primary succession, the colonization by plants and animals of a surface that previously never supported life. And of course, that can be a slow process. The first colonizers of the pumice plain at Mount St. Helens were actually ground beetles. The initial colonizers in the Galapagos is not known, but I'll vote for ground beetles. I don't know. But here we see pioneering plants on lava flows or on volcanic deposits at least. And here's a remarkable early colonist of lava flows. It's a lava cactus. It comes in really early, small cactus. It's endemic to 6 Galapagos Islands and found nowhere else in the world. So I'll use the word endemic periodically, and that means it's found only in a small location, like in the Galapagos, and nowhere else. This cactus is yellowish when it's young, and then it turns more grayish as it ages. Cacti are common in the Galapagos because of the dry season, which can be really dry or where there's no rain even for a few months. This is called Candelabra Cactus, and there are 14 species of prickly pear cactus growing in the islands. They are thought to have diverged from probably 2 ancestral stocks and then have developed on the islands into somewhat different forms. They're still all prickly pear cactus, but there's been some diversification. And these are almost like trees, and some are more tree-like than these that you see. And so prickly pear cactus seem to provide an example of mediated design, of the ability of a created organism to diversify in response to different conditions, different habitats, and so forth. The pads of prickly pear cactus are a major food source for the giant tortoises, the land iguanas. They eat them spines and all. And the fruits are eaten by mockingbirds and doves and cactus finches and such. We visited Galapagos in the dry season, and much of the low elevation plant life looked like this: leafless, dry, and brushy. These are Palo Santo trees. And the low hills appeared barren. In the wet season, this would have been, or during the El Nino, this would all be green. Some plants, however, have year-round water and do remain green. These are mangroves, which are found in many places. But of course, this is salt water, so they have to have some very special adaptations to live in salt water. Here are 4 Galapagos wildflowers, and all are yellow. In fact, most Galapagos flowers are yellow. Why is that? Here's why. The carpenter bee is by far the main native pollinator of Galapagos flowers, and for some reason it seems to be very partial to yellow. Flowers of other colors are less likely to be pollinated, so plants with yellow flowers dominate the islands. While we're on the topic of invertebrates, I thought this is a very attractive grasshopper, more so than most I've seen. It's called a painted locust. And these are Sally Lightfoot crabs, which inhabit in great numbers the rocky shores of Galapagos. And they are colorful, they are very fast-moving, they even jump. Beautiful creatures. And the question always comes up is, who is Sally Lightfoot? We heard different stories. No one is sure. Some think she was a colorful Caribbean dancer. And no, she's not related to the mayor of Chicago. Now, before we go further and look at the vertebrate animals, it's important to understand that Galapagos animals have almost no fear of people. You might sit down on the beach, as Connie did here, and be joined by mockingbirds and a sea lion. Or if you're hiking and you encounter birds or iguanas on the trail, you have to walk around them. They're not going to move for you. And the Bible indicates that the fear and dread of man came upon animals after the flood, when they were given for food. That's an appropriate time to become fearful of man. And that, of course, implies that before the flood, they did not fear humans. This scripture, Genesis 9:2, reads, "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea." It appears that Galapagos lets us experience something of what the pre-flood world was like in this sense. Why is this? I don't think it's known. Some hypothesize that there's been no big mammalian predators, so the birds and reptiles never became fearful. However, for over 300 years, Galapagos animals were slaughtered by the pirates and the whalers and the seafaring people. So they had a lot of reason to fear people. So I don't know why it didn't develop. Let me read you a couple, 3 quotes, mostly from the Grants, just about the nature of these creatures. Peter Grant writes, "The finches are much more afraid of hawks and owls than they are of us. When we walk up to them, the birds keep doing what they are doing. When an owl comes near, they head for the cactus tree. A little while ago, Rosemary was crossing a treeless spot, no cactus trees, an owl flew over, and the finches flew up from all over and landed on Rosemary." Peter Grant also wrote, "They are always perching on our shoulders, our arms, our heads. Sometimes when I'm measuring one," he measured the beaks of the finches, "a few others land up and down my wrists and arms to watch. They're curious. I was looking out to sea with binoculars once, and a hawk landed on my hat." We have a picture of it. Rosemary wrote, "Or you may pick up a bamboo pole and set it on your shoulder and begin to carry it. Suddenly the pole is very hard to hold up. You are walking and wondering, why is it so heavy? Then you turn around and see that you have a hawk hitching a ride on the back of it." Another writer said, "In the Galapagos, the birds land on the rim of your coffee cup. If there's only a little coffee left in there, they will land right inside and take a sip." So that's the way, so that makes wildlife photography, as you'll see here in a minute, much easier. Here's an iconic animal, the marine iguana. It lives on the shore, feeds in the ocean. It's the world's only seagoing lizard, and it's endemic, again, to the Galapagos Islands. Marine iguanas aggregate in colonies on the black, rocky coasts of Galapagos. In his diary, Charles Darwin called them imps of darkness. An imp is a mischievous devil. And he wrote the following: "The rocks on the coast abounded with great black lizards, between 3 and 4 feet long. It is a hideous-looking creature of a dirty black color, stupid and sluggish in its movements." Now, I would take issue with Darwin on that one. I think he was mostly wrong. Marine iguanas are not hideous, they're just different. The males in breeding season are actually somewhat colorful. They have sufficient intelligence for their rather challenging lifestyle, and when they're out battling the surf, I wouldn't call them sluggish. So I'll take the side of the iguanas there. Here's the main food of the marine iguanas: algae, red and green algae, which grows in the intertidal zone close to shore and also in the deeper waters. And the iguanas have special teeth with which they scrape this algae off of rocks. It only grows about 1 centimeter or so in height, but they get right in there and they scrape it off, and that's their food. Look at the facial profiles of 2 iguanas. On the left is the land iguana in the Galapagos, and on the right is the marine iguana. And the marine iguana's face is flattened. It's sort of a reptilian pug. And this is an adaptation to feeding really close up on rock and scraping off the algae with your special teeth. And so they're different in that very observable sense. This land iguana feeds on cactus pads particularly. Smaller iguanas usually feed close to shore and shallow water. Big males, however, often swim through the breakers to deep water and more abundant food. And they will make 5 or 10-minute dives up to 50 feet deep. Sometimes they're harassed by playful sea lions all the way out and coming back. After about a half an hour, the body temperature is falling because of the cold water, and they must again traverse the crashing waves back to shore. And then they climb up on the beach, and they're ectothermic, or cold-blooded, so they have to warm up by basking in the sun. Iguanas have another problem to correct. They're having a discussion. And that is, while underwater, they take in an awful lot of salt, and they need to eliminate that. So the solution is this. There's a salt gland located above the eye on each side. The eye, I labeled, it's closed, it's hard to see, but there's a salt gland above it that takes salt out of the bloodstream, and then that material, the salt crystals, goes into a duct to the nostril, And then the iguanas, as they are sitting basking in the sun, sneeze periodically, and out comes a spray of salt. And they're constantly doing this. And you can see the top of the head of this iguana is full of salt crystals, and that's typical. Marine iguanas are often have welcome visitors. This is a lava lizard, a little guy. And along with the Sally lightfoot crabs and certain finches and mockingbirds, these organisms come and they consume the iguanas, flies and ticks and mites and other parasites. And so we have a mutualism here between these cleaner organisms, which get lunch, and between the iguanas, which get cleaned up. And so this is a good example of mutualism, a win-win situation for both sides. Often hiking on a beach, you encounter a gathering like this. You know, for cattle, it's a herd. For quail, it's a covey. For crows, it's a murder. But for iguanas, it's a pile. And probably piling on top of each other helps them stay warm, it is believed. You go inland, away from the ocean, and we don't see the marine iguanas at all, but you see these, which are the land iguanas. And compared to the marine iguanas, these are larger, they're yellow-brown in color, they have a longer snout, and they feed on plants, especially on the prickly pear cactus, spines and all. It, interestingly, also has salt glands, but they're not particularly developed. They don't need them, but they do have something there that apparently could become a salt gland. In 1977, hybrids were found between male marine iguanas and female land iguanas, and that was on a little island called South Plaza. Hybridization is a clear indication that marine and land iguanas are of the same baramin or created kind. Hybridization is one clear indication of being in the same baramin. Connie and I did not see a hybrid, but here's a photo of one. They're small, have dark and light banding, short-lived, probably sterile, and they live on plants. They don't go into the ocean. Now, creationists believe that sometime after Noah's flood, only a few thousand years ago, iguanas were somehow transported to the Galapagos, possibly on floating vegetation mats from flooding South American rivers, maybe. And from these ancestral specimens arose all the iguanas we see today. There are 7 subspecies of marine iguanas. There are the land iguanas, there's a Santa Fe land iguana, and now we have hybrids. And from a creation point of view, hybridization between land and marine iguanas is no surprise because they appear to be both of the same created kind and should be able to hybridize. But the evolution community places a divergence of 4 or 5 million years between the divergence of land and marine iguanas. Enough time that you would think they would have changed enough not to be able to hybridize. And so thus, for evolutionists, finding hybrids was a really big surprise, as indicated here. This is a quote from Dr. Brian Milstead, head of research at the Charles Darwin Research Station on Santa Cruz. And he said, "When we saw hybridization between a land iguana and a marine iguana, that was very strange to us because they're completely different genera. They have absolutely different habitats and lifestyles, and they're so different physically that it was thought completely impossible that they could hybridize, and when they did hybridize, it was pretty much an amazing occurrence." Excuse me. Well, here's probably the best known Galapagos animal, a giant tortoise. The big ones, which are the males, are up to 600 pounds. Darwin wrote that it took 6 to 8 men to lift one from the ground. He also noted he jumped on the back of one and went for a ride. The tortoises are strictly vegetarian. Each one will eat 70, 80 pounds of plant material a day. They're also slow-moving. They've been clocked at 0.18 miles per hour. Some live for over 100 years. How much over is not really known. It's been 186 years since Darwin was on the islands. Some have speculated that maybe some tortoises alive today saw Darwin. That it seems unlikely, but it's probably not impossible. Charles Darwin recalled a comment made by the vice governor of the Galapagos, Nicholas Lawson. And Lawson indicated that he was able to tell by appearance the native island of any tortoise shell he saw. And this was probably true because the tortoises from each island differ from each other, particularly in the features of their upper shell, which is called the carapace. And the tortoises that I'm showing you here are domed. The carapace is like a dome. And notice the back of the turtle's lower neck touches the front of the shell. It would have a little trouble reaching up for that reason. Tortoises like this often live on the wetter islands or at higher elevation where there's abundant low-level vegetation, so the animal doesn't have to stretch up greatly to reach its food. And this dome shape also allows the animal to go through thick vegetation without the carapace getting hung up on vegetation. And you contrast this with this tortoise. This tortoise has a saddleback carapace. The front end is greatly elevated. It's shaped like a Spanish saddle, which is called a Galapagos, and this is the animal for whom the islands were named. Also, the neck is very long, and this animal can reach high without the hindrance of the front of the carapace. So a different morphology of shells. And these tortoises probably are adapted for the dry islands where they have to feed on these cactus trees, and they have to reach up high because everybody's eating the low cactus pads, and so reaching high is a big advantage to them. This is another view of the same animal. Some of the islands have various intermediates between the dome and saddleback morphology. So altogether there's 11 out of an original 14 different races or subspecies of Galapagos tortoises. Here's an interesting quote from an evolutionary source. It says, recent genetic studies have shown that the races of giant tortoises have evolved from a common ancestor that probably first colonized San Cristobal Island. From this island, they succeeded in dispersing to other islands where they have diverged from their parent populations. Especially notice the last sentence. It is also thought that the saddle-backed type carapace evolved independently several times as a reaction to dry environments. Multiple times this Galapagos pattern evolved. Does that sound like it could be accomplished by mutations, random mutations and natural selection, or is that a designed response to environmental conditions? You can think about that. So in a biblical model, tortoises could have arrived in the Galapagos with a vegetation mat, possibly carried by currents, perhaps transported by humans sometime after the flood. And the ancestral populations somehow dispersed to the different islands, and in response to various environmental conditions, developed appropriate adaptations for which they were already programmed or able to accomplish. Another issue concerning tortoises. Originally, there are estimated to have been 250,000 tortoises on the Galapagos Islands. Now there's about 15,000. Some islands that once had turtles have none. What happened? Well, tortoises are good eating, and they can be stored alive on ships, in ship holds, for at least a year without any food or any water. So in the 1600s through part of the 1800s, pirate ships, which were based in the Galapagos, whalers, fur seal hunters, explorers, all took tortoises aboard their vessels. Some estimate 200,000 were removed that way. The Darwin's ship, the Beagle, took 45 tortoises. More recently, tortoise populations have been decimated by introduced non-native animals, dogs, cats, pigs, goats, donkeys, rats, and other animals, which destroy the tortoise nests, consume eggs, hatchlings, and degrade the habitat. So to combat that, the Charles Darwin Research Station on Santa Cruz has a captive breeding program in which they breed tortoises and then release them back onto their islands. Hopefully the islands have had the non-invasive or the invasive creatures removed and will do much better. One very interesting observation made here is that the sex of these young turtles is not determined by their chromosomes, but it is determined by the average incubation temperature of the eggs. If the average temperature the eggs are incubated at is over 83 degrees Fahrenheit, mostly you get females. If less than 83 degrees Fahrenheit, you get mostly males. Interesting. This is postulated as one reason why tortoises that live at high elevation, where it's cooler, have to migrate to lower elevation to reproduce. If they didn't, they would produce very few females. So that's kind of strange. And with that, we're due for a break.
A couple of mentions before we break. Keith mentioned Phil Gaskell's talk that is on our YouTube channel. If you've not been to our DSA YouTube channel, you go there and search Design Science Association. We have just a few items on there that are not from this monthly meeting, very interesting items. And also, just a quick mention that during the break time, if you have not seen the chart on the table in the back over there about soft tissue found in dinosaur bones, you may want to take a look at that, including carbon-14 traces, which should not be present if they are anywhere near 1 million years old. That's a very interesting chart. Dinosaurs are not millions of years old. There's great evidence, so take a look at that. And let's break until 10:25. And remember the book table, remember the battle cry of the shopper. Remember, what is it? Charge. Yes.
And
we
if
do
you're
take
charging,
charge,
let me
please.
recommend this book. This is on the Galapagos. It's put out by Answers in Genesis Master Books. The editor is Georgia Purdom, who's a molecular geneticist, and written by many people. And it's a good book, good introductory book to a creationist view of the Galapagos Islands. Lots of pictures, good coffee table book.
Great. So at 10:25.
And I heard it's discounted.
Thank you.
Are we all ready out there? Good. Well, I did the major part of the talk, and I don't have as much left, so don't worry about that. But we have birds and briefly mammals, and then we want to go back to Charles Darwin as we conclude. So I was asked about this photograph here, and I'm taking this on the tiny island of Bartolomé. We're looking at some water then that separates Bartolomé from the island on the horizon, which is Santiago, which is a much larger island. And specifically, I was asked about the rock on the right, the pointy thing. All I know is it's called Pinnacle Rock. It's in a lot of photographs. It's famous. And it's made of volcanic material, just like everything else is here. So it's probably made of basalt, I would suspect. But somehow it's been eroded in that form, and I don't know the details of how that happened. And it tilts a little bit like the Leaning Tower. Okay, on to birds. Visitors are especially impressed with the seabirds. For example, this is the blue-footed booby. Actually, I brought one back from the islands as a souvenir, and here it is. This is a blue-footed booby. You can see the feet, and the rest of it isn't perfect, but it sort of looks like one. The feet really are blue. Now, this is a booby, and it is sky pointing, which is part of its booby courtship ritual. Maybe you wonder where the word came from, booby. Well, it probably comes from Spanish bobo, B-O-B-O, which means silly, stupid, or a fool. At least that's what my computer told me. Some have likened them to clowns because they have big blue feet and they kind of waddle a bit, so they sort of look like a clown with oversized shoes, perhaps. But actually, when they get in the air, they're not clumsy. We would be out in the boats, and the boobies would be flying, big flocks of them flying above us. And they would recognize somehow that there was a school of fish present, and they would dive in a synchronous fashion. In other words, most of them would dive at one time, hitting the water almost simultaneously, and apparently they can overwhelm the fish better that way. But look at how this diving booby here is changing its shape. Its bill and head and neck and upper body are straight as an arrow, and probably by the time it hits the water, the wings will be in that same form. So it will be simply a straight arrow-like projectile going into the water. And you might say, how fast do they hit the water? Well, 60 miles an hour. They really come in. And they slip in without making much of a wake or anything or sound. They just enter the water. And you'd think that might really clean out the sinuses, you know? I took this portrait of a booby, and one thing you notice, no nostrils. Good design. And so they breathe through the corners of their mouth, apparently. They have no nostrils, and their eyes look forward. They're not like a duck looking to each side, so this gives them good depth perception, which is important, I think, for their line of work. Well, that's the booby. Here's another bird you may recognize. Anybody know what these are? Albatross, I heard it, yeah. These are albatrosses. These are specifically called waved albatrosses, a certain species. And they're engaged in an entertaining courtship activity. It's called bill clacking. You may remember a famous poem about albatrosses in the ocean, and the famous poem is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Anybody read that in school? Yeah, I sure did. Here's a pair of albatrosses on their nest, and again, they don't mind you getting close to them at all. And their solitary egg, and after 2 months of incubation, here's their fuzzy chick. Now, the wings of an albatross are long and narrow. They are for gliding and soaring, not for flapping. Therefore, an albatross oftentimes has a difficult time taking off, and its landings are far less than graceful as well. So how do albatrosses in the Galapagos get airborne? And the answer is as simple as jumping off a cliff, which is what they do. The albatross colony, the only colony in the Galapagos, is on Espanola, and they live on the top of this cliff, and so their takeoffs are simply jumping off the cliff. Interesting, this island, just as an aside, is named Espanola in Spanish, but in English it was named Hood. So I did a little checking, and it was named for Admiral Samuel Hood of the British Navy. Guess what else was named for him? Mount Hood. So same person. And here, right on the equator, we have Galapagos penguins, and they do well in the cold water of the Humboldt Current, which is probably what brought them to the islands in the first place, I would think. Now, we tend to look at these animals and we see how remarkably adapted they are to their environment and lifestyle and so forth, but it seems like it wasn't always so. You remember Darwin's quote on the marine iguana was less than flattering. Well, here's a description of the Galapagos penguin written in 1841 by somebody you're probably familiar with. You see if you can guess who the author is. He wrote a book. He wrote, "Their bodies are grotesquely misshapen, their bills are short, their feet seemingly legless, while the members of their sides are neither fin, wing, nor arm. And truly neither fish, flesh, nor fowl is the penguin. On land it stumps, afloat it sculls, in the air it flops. As if ashamed of her failure, nature keeps this ungainly child hidden away at the ends of the earth." This guy could write. Who is it? What's that? Not Darwin. Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick. His Herman Melville sailed on whaling ships. Sailed out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, on a whaling ship, and he traveled to the Galapagos and the Hawaiian Islands and so forth. Well, this beautiful bird is a swallow-tailed gull. And notice a large eye and a striking red eye ring. And it is endemic to the Galapagos Islands, and it's very unusual in that it's largely nocturnal, hence the big eye. And it feeds miles from shore at night, generally on squid, which surface in the ocean during the night. Sometimes flying over the Anahe, we saw this distinctively shaped bird. This is a magnificent frigate bird, and it's a feathered pirate of the seas. Its job is to rob other birds of their prey. Its wingspan is like 7 feet. It's big. Greater flamingos are found in the brackish lagoons around the islands. They are thought to have emigrated from the Caribbean area. Imagine in the same islands you have penguins and flamingos. And this is a Galapagos hawk, also perfectly tame. Oftentimes it will sit on the backs of giant tortoises and use that as a post for observing for prey. It's the main predator of the marine iguanas. The bird we saw the most of, I think, was this one, and this is the Galapagos mockingbird. And the mockingbirds are numerous, inquisitive, downright nosy, totally unafraid. Charles Darwin shot mockingbirds from different islands, and after leaving Galapagos, he looked at his specimens and he noticed something remarkable. The mockingbird specimens differed slightly from island to island. Again, that's a theme we're seeing in a lot of organisms that we're talking about. Today, there are 4 mockingbird species recognized, each occupying a different part of the archipelago. And here is probably the most famous bird of the Galapagos. This is one of Darwin's finches, made even more famous in our day by this book, The Beak of the Finch, by Jonathan Weiner. I think it was 1995 or so that came out. And it is the account in detail of Peter and Rosemary Grant, who for 40 years have studied finches on that little island of Daphne Major, that small volcanic island I showed on the previous slide that had the trail leading up to the crater. Well, here we see the Grants in their home away from home. They are professors at Princeton University, I think now retired as far as I know. But they have lived here in this little cave, and then they have a little tent outside also. They've lived here for months at a time. And they have documented, followed every single finch on the island, which is several hundred birds, and measured their beaks for their size in various dimensions. So they know the finches better than anybody on the earth, I guess. There are 13 species of Darwin's finches, scattered in various habitats on the Galapagos Islands, and they do differ largely in the shape and in the size of their beaks. And this chart shows them arranged from having arisen from ancestral finches that came to the islands, and then on different islands and different places in the Galapagos, different finches, as they would say, evolved. The beaks are suited for the lifestyle of these particular finches. For example, some of the finches have tiny pointed beaks in which they are used for catching small insects. Others have robust beaks for eating large seeds, or medium beaks for eating smaller seeds. The Grant's research has also shown that finch populations can rapidly increase their average beak size in response to something like a drought. And I think Phil Gaskell showed you a graph on this. 1977, there was a drought lasting months, terrible drought. And the finches on Daphne Major, the Grants measured the depth of the beak, from top to bottom at the base of the beak, and they found that there was finches that had smaller beaks and larger beaks, And with the drought, the plants that produced the smaller seeds all died out. And you were left with a plant that produces larger seeds in a kind of a hard fruit, kind of hard to open up. And the birds that survived were the large-beaked finches, because they could open up what was about the only food remaining. And then they tracked the finches, and it came to El Nino year, and there was a lot of water, and the average beak size decreased again. Now, I'm not talking about an individual bird's beak enlarging and shrinking, but we're talking about a population, the average size within a population. And, of course, the Grants attributed that to evolution and said it's a remarkable example of evolution, maybe the best that's been observed. Here's my favorite finch. It's called a woodpecker finch. And its beak enables it to hammer on dead wood and to search for insect larvae. But it has a problem, and there are no woodpeckers on the islands. This serves as the woodpecker of the islands, but it doesn't have a long tongue like a woodpecker has. So what it has done is it has figured out how to use tools. And so it fashions sticks or cactus spines as tools, and it reaches into its excavation and skewers its lunch like a larva of some sort. Well, as I said, Darwin's 13 finches have been called the crown jewels of evolutionary biology. But note something, they always remain finches, and they provide no evidence for going beyond a created kind, and they provide no evidence really for molecules to man type evolution. Everything here is within the same baramen. For example, here's an article from Journal of Creation entitled Identification of a Large Sparrow-Finch Monobaramen in Perching Birds, written by Jean Leitner, who's a baramenologist, studies this sort of thing. She's in veterinary medicine. And she has shown evidence that at one time, sparrows, finches, and certain other groups of birds, like 1,000 species today, were in a single created kind, which has since diversified within, and that would include Darwin's finches. So this sort of changes that the Grants are noticing, and the changes of the ancestral finches to produce the different sorts of beaks and so forth, is all compatible with creation thought, showing God's has endowed these creatures with the ability to change and be adapted to a changing climate or to different habitats on different islands. So without that, it's hard to see how, if they were just rigidly fixed, how they would survive. Well, lastly, look at the mammals. And there's only 6 native mammal species on the Galapagos, 2 species of bats, 2 species of rice rats, and 2 species of sea lions. And the only mammals we saw were Galapagos sea lions, which were all over the beaches, usually taking naps. We found sea lions to be friendly, curious, playful, endearing, but they also could be aggressive, we were told, and you are not supposed to bother a 500-pound beachmaster bull in mating season. We learned that. Here's a female suckling her pup. Well, that's our description of the physical features and the biological features of the islands. Let's go back to Charles Darwin that I opened up with and try to see what his connection is with the Galapagos. Following his visit to the Galapagos, Charles Darwin wrote about the islands, their geology, their abundant wildlife, but his understanding and what I've presented are far removed from each other. How can we make sense of that? After all, we visited the same islands, and it was both in the dry season. So let's dig a little deeper into Darwin's connection with the Galapagos. Shown here is a younger Darwin than we are accustomed to seeing. When he stepped onto the Galapagos, he was 26 years old. A bit about Darwin's early life. He was born February 12, 1809, Who else? What other famous person was born that day? Abraham Lincoln, right. I don't know what significance that has, but it's an interesting piece of trivia. Charles Robert Darwin was born, I said February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury, England, and his father was Robert, who was a wealthy and successful physician. Charles, for a time, studied medicine, like his father, at the University of Edinburgh, but he didn't complete the program. Instead, he attended and graduated from Christ's College in Cambridge University in preparation for a pastorate in the Anglican Church. However, his real interest was natural history, and that's really what he pursued most of the rest of his life. After concluding his formal studies, his education, Darwin embarked on this epic round-the-world voyage on the HMS Beagle under the command of Captain Robert Fitzroy. Darwin's job as a volunteer, he didn't get paid for this, was to be the gentleman companion to the captain. And actually, surprisingly, they were about the same age. The captain was a young man as well, Fitzroy. And Darwin also became, because of his interest, the ship's naturalist. A major purpose of this journey was to travel the coastline of South America and make a map of it. And the voyage lasted 5 years, and again, they circumnavigated the globe, 1831 to 1836. And Darwin has clearly said in his writings that the high point for him was the Galapagos Islands and its remarkable geology, which first interested him, and then its wildlife. It's important to notice some people who influenced Darwin in his formative years. There was Erasmus Darwin, which was Charles's paternal grandfather, who had died before Charles Darwin was born, but yet had an influence because Erasmus wrote a 2-volume book called Zoonomia, in which he argued that life evolved over millions of years from lower forms. And so clearly this concept of evolution existed well before Charles Darwin, and certainly he heard about it in his family. Erasmus also gave the Darwin family its motto, which was E conscious omni, everything from shells. That's Latin, and that's a statement of evolution. Robert Darwin, Charles's father, was said to be a free thinker, and some say he was an agnostic. There's some who say he was probably an atheist. I don't know. But he wasn't a Bible-believing Christian, I don't think, at all. Charles's mentors during his university days included Robert Grant. He was an atheist and an evolutionist, and Robert Jameson, who held to millions of years in evolution. Of great importance, especially of great importance, is Charles Lyell. And Charles Lyell wrote a book on geology, Principles of Geology, and Darwin was reading this as he traveled around South America on the Beagle. And Lyell especially espoused the doctrine of uniformitarianism, which I expect most of you are familiar with, but it's basically that the processes of geology operate very slowly over millions of years. Nothing hurries geology. A stated goal of Lyell was, quote, to free the science of geology from Moses. Darwin's worldview upon entering the Galapagos would have been something like this. Because of these influences and his thinking at that time, you can say, what was going through his mind? Well, first of all, and he says this in a quote, Genesis is wrong on history and science. He held that to be the case. He also believed that, and was coming more and more to believe, that geologic processes occurred slowly and gradually over millions of years from the influence of Lyell and also his observations in South America. And he was considering the possibility that species of organisms possibly developed by natural processes from lower forms. That had been in his thinking as well. He also believed that the Bible taught the fixity of species. That is, species of organisms are immutable. They don't change. They don't adapt. There's no new species. He felt that the Bible taught that, I think largely because the church at that time commonly held that view. And of course, that's not a correct view. Darwin wrote the following concerning his time on the Beagle. He said, "But I had gradually come by this time to see that the Old Testament, from its manifestly false history of the world, with the Tower of Babel, the rainbow as a sign, etc., was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus or the beliefs of the barbarian." Now here's an important quote from Dr. Terry Mortensen. He received his PhD in the history of geology at Coventry University in England. And Dr. Mortensen writes this. He says, "Before Darwin ever landed on Galapagos, he had already rejected the truth about origins revealed in the Word of God, and as a disciple of Lyell, was well prepared to apply the uniformitarian principle of slow, gradual geologic change over millions of years to the question of biological origins. He was not an unbiased pursuer of truth. Rather, the assumptions based on his anti-biblical, naturalistic worldview controlled his interpretation of what he saw in the world. Just like our biblical worldview, I think, controls, and hopefully does control, what we see in our world. Here we see now a picture showing the HMS Beagle at the tip of South America in the Strait of Magellan before arriving in the Galapagos. And this map traces his journey through the Galapagos. I'm sure you can't tell too much about that, but he went to certain islands and bypassed others. And he arrived in September 15th, 1835, during the dry season. He visited, that is, he got off and explored 4 islands: San Cristobal, Floriana, Isabela, and Santiago. He explored, he observed, he took notes, he collected specimens, rocks, plants, animals, bugs, beetles, he liked beetles, mockingbirds, finches, iguanas. He shot a lot of things. He was an avid shooter, and he collected lots of specimens. He had material to work on. And he had some failings. He neglected to record which islands his finch specimens were collected on. I can sympathize because I couldn't tell which island some of my photographs were taken on either. And then he did not recognize, and this may be understandable too, but he did not recognize that all of his finches were finches. He thought one was a blackbird and one was a wren. And so it wasn't until he got back to England, he gave his bird collection to John Gould, an ornithologist, who figured out that these were all finches, and set Darwin straight on that. Darwin also, strangely, did not save any tortoise shells, even though he had talked to Lawson, who said they were different island to island. But the Beagle took on 45 tortoises. They ate them all and threw the shells in the ocean. Why didn't Darwin save some tortoise shells? I'm not sure. Darwin had been on the islands for 5 weeks, and then he departed and never returned. After the Galapagos, Darwin worked on his collections. He shared his collections and donated them to museums and to other people like John Gould, and others worked on his collections. He studied, he corresponded with scientists, and this was for over 20 years. In 1859, he published Origin of the Species, which popularized evolution and postulated this mechanism of natural selection as a way in which evolution operates. And then throughout the rest of his life, Darwin continued to attribute his ideas on origins to the Galapagos Islands. He stated that. Julian Huxley, who was a grandson of Thomas Huxley. Thomas Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog, a great promoter of Charles Darwin. But Julian Huxley in 1966 wrote, "It was on the Galapagos that Darwin took his first step out of the fairyland of creationism into the coherent and comprehensible world of modern biology." Here is an image. This is the famous I think diagram from Darwin's notebook. He sketched here the evolutionary tree of life, which really represents the culmination of his thought and work. And it's a single tree of life, life starting at the base of that diagram and then branching out as a tree branches and as different species and types of organisms evolve. What it was not was an orchard of life. He has evolution view holds to a single tree of life, the creation view to multiple trees, that is multiple created kinds, like an orchard. So Darwin then had achieved his goal, which was, in his words, and he said this, his goal was to murder God by providing a totally secular interpretation of life on Earth, thus eliminating the need for a supernatural creator. So, in summary, Darwin correctly recognized the abundant evidence for adaptation and speciation of plants and animals found in the Galapagos Islands. However, Darwin's anti-biblical worldview of naturalism, evolutionism, and uniformitarianism dictated his interpretations of what he observed. And constrained by his worldview, Darwin incorrectly, I would believe, understood Galapagos as providing evidence for millions of years of gradual naturalistic evolutionary processes. And he subsequently convinced through his book, through his writings, much of the world of that view. In reality, I would suggest that Galapagos Islands are best seen in the context of a biblical creation flood model of Earth history. Rather than being a great laboratory for the study of evolution, Galapagos is a magnificent showcase for creation and the flood. Now, let me read, in concluding, a quote from Tom Hennigan, who's a creationist ecologist, and he wrote this after exploring the Galapagos. As I explored these islands, heralded as the Mecca for evolutionary naturalists, it was obvious to me that these islands instead powerfully reflect the Creator's abilities, or attributes, of beauty, design, provision, and sustainment in a fallen and imperfect world. Each day brought renewed experiences of worship, joy, and thankfulness as I reflected on being in the company of creatures that showed no fear. I sat among marine iguanas as they went about their daily feeding and sunbathing rituals. I walked with giant tortoises as they grazed upon their midday meal. I snorkeled with sea lions that wanted to play. I ate with Darwin's finches that desired to share my food. You're not allowed to feed the animals in Galapagos, by the way. It seemed that God wanted me to glimpse Adam's world before the fall and embrace the hope that his children look forward to when Christ makes all things new and creation is at peace. I will never forget my time in those mysterious lands, because it was there that Christ gave me a glimpse into both himself and the promises he has made for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Well, I think it's now time to wave goodbye to the islands and sail away into a beautiful Galapagos sunset. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much, Keith. We'll have a little time of Q&A.